Dust and smoke filled the air as explosions rocked the ground beneath David Cole's boots. He fired another burst from his rifle, dropping 2 Krovan soldiers as they charged through the ruined street. Around him, the last defenders of Ashfall Ridge were falling back toward the evacuation zone. Civilians screamed in the distance, running for the transport ships that would carry them to safety. "Cole, we need to move now," his squad leader shouted over the comm link. David glanced behind him. 3 families were still trapped in a collapsed building, visible through a broken wall. He could hear children crying inside. The Krovan forces were less than 2 blocks away. "Go without me. I'll catch the next shuttle," David said, already running toward the building. "There is no next shuttle, Marine." "This is the last one." David didn't respond. He kicked through the weakened doorway and found the families huddled in what used to be a living room. A father clutched his daughter while his wife held their infant son. Next to them, an elderly couple sat frozen with fear. "Come on, all of you. We're getting out of here," David said, helping them to their feet. He led them through the burning streets, his rifle ready. Twice they had to hide as Krovan patrols passed by. The old man struggled to keep pace, and David ended up carrying him on his back while still maintaining his weapon. The sounds of battle grew louder behind them. The Krovan were advancing faster than expected. When they finally reached the landing zone, David's heart sank. The last transport was already lifting off, its engines roaring as it climbed into the darkening sky. He'd known it would be gone, but seeing it disappear still felt like a punch to the gut. "What do we do now?" the mother asked, clutching her baby tighter. David spotted a bunker entrance nearby, one of the old colonial administration shelters. "In there. Everyone inside quickly." He got them settled in the reinforced structure, then sealed the door. The bunker had supplies for maybe 2 weeks. By then, hopefully, another rescue would come. David took up position near the entrance, checking his ammunition. He had 4 magazines left. The ground shook as artillery shells began to fall. The Krovan were bombarding the abandoned colony, destroying anything of value. David heard the distinctive whine of a heavy shell incoming, too close. He threw himself over the families as the world exploded above them. The ceiling came down in a cascade of concrete and steel. David felt crushing weight slam into his back, driving the air from his lungs. Pain shot through his left leg and right arm. Something heavy pinned him to the ground. He tried to move but couldn't. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision. His emergency beacon activated automatically, sending out a distress signal, but the impact had damaged it. The signal it transmitted showed a flat line, indicating no life signs detected. Far above the planet, aboard the fleet carrier Defiance, Captain Williams received the casualty reports. 7 Marines listed as killed in action during the evacuation. Among them was Sergeant David Cole. Williams had served with Cole for 3 years. The man was one of the best soldiers he'd ever known. Note in his file that he died buying time for civilians. Williams said quietly, "He deserves that much." The fleet jumped to hyperspace, leaving Ashfall Ridge to the Krovan occupation forces. Back on the surface, rescue would not be coming. David didn't know how long he was unconscious. When awareness slowly returned, everything hurt. His mouth was dry, his throat raw from inhaled dust. The weight on his back made it hard to breathe. Complete darkness surrounded him. He tried to call out, but his voice came as barely a whisper. "Anyone there?" Silence answered him. No, not quite silence. He could hear small sounds like rubble shifting somewhere nearby. Then he heard something else. A soft chirping sound, almost like a bird but deeper. The chirping came closer. David felt vibrations through the concrete as something moved above the rubble pile. More chirping joined the first, creating a strange chorus. Whatever they were, there were several of them. David managed to turn his head slightly. A gap in the rubble let in a thin beam of moonlight. In that pale light, he saw something that made him question if he was hallucinating from his injuries. A scaled snout pushed through the gap, sniffing at him. The creature was roughly the size of a large dog, with dark gray scales that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its eyes were bright and intelligent, studying him with obvious curiosity. Then another head appeared, this one with reddish scales, then a third with blue scales, and finally a fourth with metallic silver coloring. Dragon hatchlings. David had seen pictures of Drakari in the colonial wildlife guides, but those said the species was extinct on this world. Apparently the guides were wrong. The gray one chirped again and began pulling at the rubble near David's head. The others joined in, and David realized with shock that they were trying to dig him out. They worked with surprising coordination, each one pulling at different pieces of debris. "Hey, easy there," David croaked. "Don't bring the whole pile down." The hatchlings paused at the sound of his voice, tilting their heads. Then they resumed their work more carefully this time. It took over an hour, but eventually they cleared enough space for David to drag himself free. His left leg was badly injured, possibly broken. His right arm wasn't much better. But he was alive, and these strange little creatures had saved him. David collapsed on the ground outside the rubble, gasping for air. The 4 hatchlings gathered around him, still chirping softly. One of them, the silver one, gently nudged his uninjured hand with its snout. "Thanks, little ones," David whispered. "I owe you." As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, David saw more clearly where he was. The bunker had completely collapsed. The families he'd tried to save were gone, buried under tons of concrete. He was the only survivor, and only because these hatchlings had found him. Grief threatened to overwhelm him, but David pushed it down. He was still alive. That meant he had a job to do: survive, find a way to get off this rock, and figure out what to do with 4 baby dragons who seemed to think he was their new parent. The gray hatchling curled up against his side, sharing its warmth. The others followed suit, surrounding him in a protective circle. David closed his eyes, letting exhaustion take him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tonight he just needed to rest and heal. In orbit, the casualty reports were already filed. Sergeant David Cole was officially declared killed in action, his body presumed lost in the bombardment. His family back on Earth would receive notification within the week. His name would be added to the memorial wall. But on the surface of Ashfall Ridge, among the ruins and the lingering smoke, David Cole breathed and lived. And 4 dragon hatchlings had chosen him as their family. 3 days had passed since the hatchlings dug David from the rubble. He'd managed to fashion a splint for his leg using debris and torn cloth from his uniform. The pain was constant but bearable. What worried him more was infection. His medical kit had been lost in the collapse, leaving him with nothing to treat his wounds properly. The 4 hatchlings had stayed with him constantly. They brought him water in their mouths, carried carefully from a broken pipe they'd discovered. The gray one, which David had started calling Ash, seemed to be the leader. It organized the others when they went searching for food or water. The red one was Crimson, aggressive and protective. The blue one moved with playful energy, so David named it Sky. The silver one showed remarkable intelligence in problem-solving, earning the name Silver. David had set up camp in the shell of a warehouse near the collapsed bunker. The roof was mostly intact, providing shelter from the elements. He'd scavenged what he could from nearby buildings. A few ration packs, some basic tools, and most importantly, a working data pad that he'd found in an abandoned office. The pad showed him just how bad things were. The entire colony was under Krovan control. They'd established a military base near the old spaceport and were using Ashfall Ridge as a staging ground for further attacks on human settlements. Patrols moved through the ruins regularly, searching for salvage and any surviving humans. David knew he had to stay hidden. 1 Marine with broken bones and 4 baby dragons wouldn't last long against Krovan soldiers. He needed time to heal, and the hatchlings needed time to grow. On the 4th day, the hatchlings brought him something besides water. Crimson proudly dropped a dead rabbit-like creature at his feet, its neck cleanly broken. The other 3 had similar catches. They looked at David expectantly, their tails swishing. "You guys hunted for me?" David asked, genuinely touched. The hatchlings chirped happily. David realized they were mimicking behavior they would have learned from their mother. They were bringing food to their parent, just like any young predator would. Except David wasn't their parent, and he couldn't digest raw meat the way they could. He needed fire. Using the tools he'd scavenged, David built a small fire pit inside the warehouse, positioning it under a hole in the roof so the smoke would dissipate. The hatchlings watched with fascination as he worked. When he finally got a fire going using some chemical accelerant from a maintenance closet, they all jumped back in alarm. "It's okay," David said softly. "Fire is good. Fire helps us." He cooked the meat the hatchlings had brought, and the smell seemed to reassure them. They crept closer, drawn by the scent. David ate his portion, savoring the first real food he'd had in days. Then he noticed the hatchlings watching the fire with intense interest. Crimson opened its mouth and a small puff of smoke came out. The hatchling looked startled by its own action. Then it tried again, and this time a tiny flame flickered between its jaws. Well, that's new, David muttered. Over the next hour, he watched as all 4 hatchlings discovered their abilities. Crimson could produce fire, though small flames for now. Ash breathed out a dark, acrid smoke that made David's eyes water. Sky generated tiny sparks of what looked like electricity. Silver opened its mouth, and David felt a pressure wave, like a focused pulse of sound. These weren't just any dragons. They were elementals, each with a different natural weapon. And they were just babies. David wondered what they'd be capable of when fully grown. That night, a Krovan patrol passed within 50 meters of the warehouse. David heard their guttural voices and the heavy tread of their boots. He pressed himself against the wall, hand over his mouth to quiet his breathing. The hatchlings seemed to sense the danger. They stayed absolutely silent, their eyes fixed on the doorway. One Krovan soldier wandered closer, perhaps drawn by some scent or sound. David's hand moved to the knife at his belt. If they were discovered, he'd go down fighting. The hatchlings tensed, ready to defend him despite their size. The soldier paused at the warehouse entrance. David could see its silhouette against the moonlight. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then another Krovan called out, and the soldier turned away. The patrol moved on. David let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That had been too close. He needed to find a safer location, somewhere farther from the Krovan patrol routes. Over the next 2 weeks, David's leg slowly healed. He could put weight on it again, though it still hurt. The hatchlings grew noticeably larger, now the size of ponies. Their abilities grew stronger too. They practiced their elemental attacks on rubble, learning control. David started teaching them commands. Simple things at first: stay, come, hide. The hatchlings learned with surprising speed. Silver was the quickest to understand, often figuring out what David wanted before he finished the command. Ash was the most obedient, following orders precisely. Sky had trouble focusing but was eager to please. Crimson was stubborn, doing things its own way unless David was firm. One morning, David found the reason the hatchlings had been alone. Following tracks they'd left in the dust, he discovered a cave system in the nearby hills. Inside, he found a massive dragon easily 20 meters long. It was dead, killed by Krovan weapons. Burn marks and bullet holes covered its body. The 4 hatchlings stood at the entrance of the cave, staring at their mother's corpse. They made low, mournful sounds that broke David's heart. "I'm sorry, little ones," David said quietly. "I know what it's like to lose family." He spent the day helping them pile rocks over their mother's body, creating a cairn. It wasn't much, but it felt right. When they finished, the 4 hatchlings returned to David and pressed close against him. He wrapped his arms around them as best he could. "I've got you now," he promised. "We're family. I'll protect you and you protect me. Deal?" The hatchlings chirped in agreement. From that day forward, their bond deepened. They were no longer just a man and 4 dragons sharing space. They were a unit, a family forged in loss and survival. David found maps in the datapad showing remote areas of the planet, far from Krovan activity. He chose a canyon system in the northern wilderness, about 300 kilometers away. It would be a long journey, especially with his leg still healing, but they needed to move. Before they left, David scavenged more supplies. He found an old military comm unit, damaged but potentially repairable. He took spare parts, tools, and anything else that might be useful. The hatchlings helped carry things, learning to work as a team. On the morning they departed, David looked back at the ruins of Ashfall Ridge one last time. Somewhere in the wreckage were the families he'd tried to save. Somewhere out there, his squad thought he was dead. "I'll survive," David said to the empty city. "I'll find a way home, and I'll make sure their sacrifice meant something." Ash nudged his hand gently. The hatchlings were ready to go. David shouldered his pack and started walking north. 4 dragons followed close behind, their eyes alert for danger. They had a long road ahead, but they would face it together. 6 months changed everything. The canyon David had chosen as their home was perfect. Tall stone walls provided natural defense, and a stream running through the center gave them fresh water. Caves dotted the canyon sides, offering shelter from storms. Most importantly, it was far from any Krovan activity. The hatchlings were no longer hatchlings. They'd grown to the size of horses, their bodies powerful and sleek. Crimson's scales had deepened to a rich red that seemed to glow in sunlight. Ash's gray scales had darkened to nearly black, helping it blend into shadows. Sky's blue had brightened to an electric azure. Silver's metallic scales shimmered like polished steel. David had changed too. His leg had healed, though he walked with a slight limp. His body had hardened from months of survival living. His hair was longer and a beard covered his jaw. The clean-cut Marine was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he belonged in the wilderness. He'd turned the largest cave into a base camp. Salvaged equipment lined the walls. Solar panels he'd scavenged powered a small computer system. Maps covered one wall, showing the locations of every Krovan base and patrol route he'd identified. David had been busy. The dragons had become his squad, and he trained them like Marines. Each morning started with exercises. They practiced coordinated movements, learning to work as a unit. David taught them hand signals he'd modified from military commands. A raised fist meant stop. An open palm meant advance. Pointing meant attack that target. Silver understood the signals best and often helped train the others. Ash was the most disciplined, never breaking formation without orders. Sky had boundless energy but had learned to channel it when needed. Crimson remained the most aggressive, always eager for action. Their elemental abilities had grown tremendously. Crimson could now breathe sustained streams of fire hot enough to melt metal. Ash's toxic smoke could fill a large area, choking any creature that breathed it. Sky's lightning could arc between targets, and David had watched it fry a piece of equipment from 20 meters away. Silver's sonic blasts could shatter stone and knock enemies off their feet. David drilled them constantly. They practiced ambush tactics, hit-and-run attacks, defensive formations. He taught them to use terrain to their advantage. The dragons learned fast, their intelligence matching or exceeding human levels in some ways. One afternoon, while David was repairing the comm unit, Ash suddenly raised its head and growled low. The other dragons immediately went on alert. David grabbed his rifle and moved to the cave entrance. A Krovan patrol was moving through the canyon, 6 soldiers armed with energy weapons. They must have wandered far from their normal routes. David cursed under his breath. He'd known this day would come, but he'd hoped for more time. He couldn't let them leave. If they reported this location, Krovan forces would flood the area. David would have to relocate again, and he was tired of running. Besides, he had 4 very capable dragons now. Using hand signals, David positioned his squad. Ash and Silver took the high ground on opposite sides of the canyon. Crimson and Sky stayed with him at ground level. The Krovan were walking into a perfect kill zone. David waited until the patrol was directly below Ash's position. Then he gave the signal to attack. Ash dropped from above, landing on the rear guard and crushing him under its weight. Its toxic smoke billowed out, filling the canyon floor. The Krovan soldiers shouted in alarm, raising their weapons. That's when Silver fired its sonic blast from the other side, the concussive force sending 2 soldiers flying into the canyon wall. Crimson charged from the front, breathing fire that engulfed one soldier completely. Sky leaped over David's head, lightning crackling between its jaws. The electric discharge jumped from one Krovan to another, their armor conducting the current. The entire fight lasted less than 30 seconds. 6 Krovan soldiers lay dead or dying in the canyon. The dragons had executed the ambush perfectly, following David's commands without hesitation. David moved among the bodies, checking for survivors. There were none. He felt nothing about killing them. These were the same species that had massacred civilians on Ashfall Ridge. They would have killed him and his dragons without mercy. Good work, David told his squad. The dragons chirped proudly, pleased with their success. He searched the bodies and found something valuable, a portable data unit containing patrol schedules and base layouts. This was intelligence gold. David also took their weapons and ammunition. The energy rifles wouldn't work for him without proper training, but he could study them. That night, David finally got the comm unit working. It could only receive, not transmit yet, but that was enough. He tuned into military frequencies and listened to human fleet communications. What? He heard made his blood run cold. The Krovan were planning a major offensive against the colony world of Haven's Gate. They'd been building up forces for months, and the attack would come within 2 weeks. Haven's Gate had over 2 million civilians and minimal military defenses. It would be a slaughter. David had to warn someone. He worked through the night trying to modify the comm unit to transmit. The dragons watched him work, sensing his urgency. By dawn, he'd made progress, but the unit still couldn't send signals far enough to reach human space. He needed a more powerful transmitter. David pulled up his maps and scanned for options. There was an old research outpost in the Northern Territories about 200 kilometers away. According to the records, it had subspace communication equipment, but there was a problem. The Krovan had turned it into a forward operating base. David studied the satellite images he'd managed to download months ago. The base had maybe 30 soldiers, heavy weapons, and vehicle support. Attacking it head-on would be suicide, but a small team could infiltrate at night, reach the communications room, and send a message before escaping. He looked at his dragons. They'd grown strong and capable, but were they ready for a mission this dangerous? Was he ready to risk their lives? Ash walked over and gently bumped David's shoulder with its snout. The dragon looked at him with those intelligent eyes, and David saw understanding there. They knew what was at stake. They were ready to fight. "All right," David said, making his decision. "We're going to need a plan, and we're going to need to move fast." He spent the next 3 days planning every detail of the mission. He mapped out patrol routes, identified weak points in the base defenses, and planned multiple escape routes. The dragons trained for the specific tasks they'd need to perform. On the 4th day, they set out. David rode on Crimson's back, something the dragons had recently become large enough to allow. The other 3 flew alongside them. It felt strange and wonderful at the same time, riding a dragon through the sky. As they flew north toward the research outpost, David thought about his old squad. If he succeeded, they'd learn he was alive. His family would know he hadn't died on Ashfall Ridge, and maybe, just maybe, he could save Haven's Gate from the same fate that had befallen his colony. The sun was setting when they saw the outpost in the distance. Lights blazed from the compound, and David could see Krovan vehicles moving around the perimeter. This was going to be the most dangerous thing he'd attempted since the evacuation, but he wasn't alone anymore. He had his squad, his family, 4 dragons who trusted him completely. "All right, team," David said quietly. "Let's show these Krovan what happens when you corner a human marine and his dragons." Darkness covered the land as David and his dragons approached the research outpost. They'd landed 2 kilometers away and moved in on foot, staying low to avoid detection. The dragons proved surprisingly quiet when they wanted to be. Their movements calculated and precise. David had painted black streaks on his face using charcoal and wrapped dark cloth around his remaining gear to prevent reflections. The dragons needed no camouflage. Ash's dark scales made it nearly invisible in the shadows. The others stayed close behind, following hand signals. Through his salvage binoculars, David studied the base layout. The Krovan had fortified the old research station well. Walls topped with automated guns surrounded the compound. Guards patrolled in pairs, their thermal scanners sweeping the perimeter. A heavy vehicle sat near the main gate, its weapon systems active. But every defense has a weakness. David had found theirs. The western side of the compound backed against a rocky hillside. The Krovan had deemed it secure because the hill was too steep for vehicles. They were right about vehicles. But dragons could climb anything. David signaled his squad. They moved along the base of the hill, using the terrain for cover. When they reached the western wall, David examined it closely. The automated guns had blind spots where the hill blocked their firing angles. It was a narrow gap, but enough. "Ash, Silver, you're up," David whispered. The 2 dragons climbed the hill silently. When they reached the top, they had a perfect view into the compound. David watched through his binoculars as Ash released a stream of toxic smoke. The wind carried it down into the base, spreading through the courtyard. Krovan soldiers began coughing and stumbling. Alarms blared as they realized they were under attack. Guards rushed around in confusion, trying to find the source of the smoke. That's when Silver fired. The sonic blast hit the western wall, cracking the reinforced concrete. The automated guns swiveled toward the sound, but their programming couldn't target something above and behind the wall. They fired randomly, adding to the chaos. David and the other 2 dragons moved. Crimson breathed fire at the weakened section of wall, heating it until the concrete began to crumble. Sky followed with lightning strikes, the electrical energy shattering the already compromised structure. The wall collapsed inward, creating an opening. "Go, go, go," David shouted. They rushed through the breach. Krovan soldiers were everywhere, but most were still reeling from the smoke. David dropped 3 with precise rifle shots. Crimson incinerated 2 more who tried to flank them. Sky's lightning arced through a group of 4, dropping them instantly. The plan was working. They'd created enough chaos that the defenders didn't know where to focus their efforts. Half the guards were dealing with the smoke on the western side. The others were responding to the breach. Nobody expected the attack to come from both directions simultaneously. David ran toward the main building where the communications equipment would be housed. Ash and Silver dropped from the hillside, landing among the confused soldiers. Their combined assault scattered the remaining defenders. A Krovan officer emerged from the command center, roaring orders. He carried a heavy plasma rifle and fired at Crimson. The shot scored across the dragon's shoulder, burning scales. Crimson roared in pain and anger, then unleashed a massive gout of flame. The officer's screams were mercifully brief. David reached the main building's entrance. It was locked, the door reinforced. "Silver!" The dragon responded immediately, firing a focused sonic blast at the door. The lock mechanism shattered and David kicked the door open. Inside, emergency lights flashed red. He ran through corridors he'd memorized from old facility blueprints, heading for the communications room. 2 Krovan soldiers stepped out to intercept him. David shot one and dove aside as the other returned fire. Before the soldier could finish him, Sky appeared in the doorway. Lightning struck the Krovan and he collapsed in a smoking heap. The communications room was exactly where the blueprint said it would be. David entered and found the equipment still functional. The Krovan had been using it to coordinate their operations. He quickly disabled their encryptions and began setting up for a transmission to human space. Outside, the sounds of battle continued. His dragons were holding off the remaining Krovan forces, but reinforcements would arrive soon. David worked as fast as he could, his fingers flying across the unfamiliar controls. He encoded a burst transmission with everything he knew about the Krovan offensive against Haven's Gate. Ship numbers, attack vectors, timing, everything. He included the patrol schedules and base locations from the data unit he'd found. It was enough intelligence to potentially save thousands of lives. Then David added his personal identification codes, the codes that were supposed to have died with him on Ashfall Ridge. He hesitated for just a moment before hitting send. The transmission burst outward at faster-than-light speeds, crossing the void toward human fleet positions. The moment it sent, every Krovan communication system in the base lit up with alerts. They knew someone had accessed their network. "Time to go," David shouted, running back toward the entrance. The courtyard was a war zone. Bodies lay everywhere, both Krovan and equipment destroyed. His dragons had held the line, but they were tiring. Crimson's wound was bleeding, and Ash had taken hits from energy weapons. A Krovan heavy walker emerged from a hangar, its weapons powering up. The massive vehicle could shred them all in seconds. David raised his rifle, knowing it was useless against that kind of armor. Then he heard the distinctive sound of aircraft engines. 2 Krovan gunships appeared over the compound, drawn by the base's distress calls. "They were trapped, to me," David shouted. The dragons converged on his position. They formed a defensive circle, preparing for a last stand. David checked his ammunition. 1 magazine left. This wasn't how he'd planned to go, but at least the message had gotten out. Haven's Gate might be saved. The gunships descended, their weapons targeting the group. David braced himself. Lightning suddenly struck both gunships simultaneously. But it wasn't from Sky. This lightning was different, more powerful. The gunships exploded in midair, raining debris across the compound. David looked up in shock. 3 massive dragons descended from the night sky, each easily twice the size of his dragons. An adult Drakari, ancient and powerful, landed between David's group and the heavy walker. With a single blast of flame, it melted the walker into slag. More adult dragons appeared, dozens of them, emerging from the darkness. They'd been hidden, watching. Now they attacked the Krovan base with devastating efficiency. In less than 2 minutes, every enemy soldier was dead, every vehicle destroyed. The ancient dragon that had saved them approached David. It moved with careful dignity, its scales pale with age. When it spoke, David heard the words in his mind rather than his ears. "Human who was chosen by the young ones. We have watched your bond with interest." David's mind reeled. The dragons could speak telepathically. They'd been watching him and his squad for months. "We thought our kind would never choose again," the ancient one continued. "But the 4 younglings saw something in you. Courage, protection, family. They chose wisely." Crimson, despite its wound, moved to stand beside David protectively. The other 3 joined it, forming a wall between him and the ancient dragon. The ancient one made a sound like laughter. "Peace, younglings. I mean your human no harm." Indeed, you have done something remarkable. You have reminded us why our ancestors once bonded with other species. Behind the ancient dragon, more adults gathered. They looked at David and his 4 dragons with what seemed like respect. Your message will reach your people, the Ancient One said. But know this, human. When you fly with dragons, you never fly alone. We will be watching. We will be waiting. And when the time comes, we will answer your call. With that, the adult dragons took flight, disappearing into the night sky as suddenly as they'd appeared. David was left standing among the ruins of the Crovan base, his 4 dragons pressed close around him. Silver's wound was already clotting. Dragon healing was apparently very efficient. David allowed himself a moment of relief before reality set in. We need to move. More Crovan will come to investigate. But as they fled into the darkness, David couldn't stop thinking about what the ancient dragon had said. His message was out there now, racing toward human space. Soon everyone would know that Sergeant David Cole was alive. And more importantly, they'd know about the Crovan offensive. Haven's Gate could be saved. David had lost everything on Ashfall Ridge. But maybe, just maybe, he'd found a way to make that sacrifice mean something. He had his dragons, his family. And apparently he had the attention of an entire species of ancient, powerful beings. The war was far from over. But for the first time in months, David felt hope. The transmission reached the human fleet carrier Valor 7 days after David sent it. Communications officer Rita Walsh was monitoring routine channels when her screen suddenly lit up with an incoming burst transmission. The encryption was old, military grade from over a year ago. She ran the decryption protocols and froze when she saw the sender identification codes. Admiral Foster, you need to see this immediately, she said over the comm. Admiral Peter Foster arrived at the communications station within minutes. He'd commanded the 3rd Fleet for 15 years and had seen plenty of strange things, but nothing prepared him for what Walsh showed him. These codes belong to Sergeant David Cole, Foster said slowly. He died on Ashfall Ridge during the evacuation. The timestamp is from 6 days ago, sir. And there's more. Intelligence data about a Crovan offensive targeting Haven's Gate. Foster read through the intelligence carefully. Ship movements, attack patterns, timing. If this was real, they had less than a week to prepare defenses. But if it was a Crovan trap using stolen codes, deploying the fleet would leave other colonies vulnerable. Verify those codes again. Check them against every database we have. Walsh worked for an hour, running every verification she could think of. The codes were legitimate. They matched Cole's personal encryption, his command patterns, even his typing speed and syntax preferences. Either Cole was alive or the Crovan had managed to perfectly fake a dead Marine's communication style. There's something else, Admiral, Walsh said. The transmission originated from inside a Crovan military base. Whoever sent this fought their way in, accessed their systems, and got out. Foster made his decision. Sound General Quarters. I want the fleet ready to move in 2 hours. Send fast couriers to Haven's Gate with the intelligence. And someone find me Major Williams. Major Brian Williams, formerly Captain Williams, was overseeing training operations when he got the summons. He entered Foster's ready room with curiosity. The Admiral looked troubled. Brian, what can you tell me about David Cole? Williams felt his chest tighten. Cole had been one of his best Marines. Losing him on Ashfall Ridge still hurt. He was an excellent soldier, sir. Brave, loyal, never left anyone behind. Why? Foster handed him the data pad. Williams read it in silence, his hands starting to shake. This can't be real, Williams said finally. I saw the casualty reports. His beacon flatlined. Maybe his beacon malfunctioned. Maybe he was injured and unconscious when it activated. The point is, someone using his code sent us intelligence about a major Crovan offensive. I'm taking the fleet to Haven's Gate, and I'm authorizing a rescue operation to Ashfall Ridge. Williams looked up sharply. You're going after him? If there's even a chance Cole is alive, we bring him home. Pick your team, Major. You leave in 4 hours. The rescue team consisted of 2 squads of Marines and Williams himself. They took a fast attack ship that could slip past Crovan patrols. The journey to Ashfall Ridge would take 3 days at maximum speed. Meanwhile, the 3rd Fleet moved toward Haven's Gate with the intelligence David had provided. Foster deployed his ships according to the Crovan attack patterns in the data. If Cole's information was accurate, they'd be ready. On Ashfall Ridge, David had no idea what was happening. He'd returned to his canyon base with his dragons, treating their wounds and trying to rest. The raid on the research outpost had been successful, but costly. Crimson's shoulder was healing slowly, and Ash had burns from Crovan energy weapons. David sat outside the cave watching the sunset. His dragons rested nearby, their breathing deep and even. He wondered if his message had reached anyone. Maybe it had been intercepted. Maybe the Krovan had somehow blocked it. Sky suddenly raised its head, looking toward the southern sky. The other dragon stirred, sensing something. David grabbed his rifle and scanned the horizon. Ships were approaching. Human ships, from the design, 3 dropships in standard military formation. David's heart pounded. Either they'd received his message and were investigating, or this was just a random patrol. Either way, he had to be careful. The dropships circled the canyon, clearly searching for something. One of them began to descend, heading straight for David's position. They knew he was here. Easy, David told his dragons. Let's see what they want. The dropship landed 50 meters from the cave. Its rear ramp lowered and Marines poured out in full combat gear. David recognized the tactical formation immediately. These weren't just any Marines. This was an extraction team. Then he saw William step out of the dropship and David's throat tightened with emotion. "Cole," William shouted. "David Cole, if that's you, stand down. We're here to bring you home." David stepped forward into the light, his dragons moving with him protectively. The Marines raised their weapons in alarm at the sight of the dragons. "Hold fire," David shouted. "They're with me." Williams walked forward slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief. When he got close enough to see David's face clearly, he stopped. "My God, it really is you. We thought you were dead." "So did I for a while," David said. His voice cracked slightly. "Did my message get through? About Haven's Gate? It did. Admiral Foster deployed the fleet based on your intelligence." "But Cole, what the hell are those things?" David glanced back at his dragons. They watched the Marines warily but held their position because David had signaled them to stay calm. "These are my family. I wouldn't have survived without them. They're called Drakkari, and they're more intelligent than you'd believe. They go where I go." Williams looked at the 4 massive dragons, then back at David. "The brass is going to have a field day with this, but right now I don't care. You're alive, and that's all that matters. We're getting you out of here." "Not without them," David said firmly. One of the other Marines spoke up. "Sir, we can't transport those creatures." "They're dangerous." Crimson growled at that, smoke rising from its nostrils. David placed a hand on the dragon's side, calming it. "They saved my life. They've fought beside me for 6 months. I trust them more than I trust most humans. They come with me or I don't go." Williams considered this. He'd known David Cole for years. The man was stubborn, loyal to a fault, and never made idle threats. If he said he wouldn't leave without the dragons, he meant it. "All right, we'll figure something out, but we need to move now. Krovan patrols are getting more active in this sector." Getting the dragons onto the dropship required some creative engineering. They were too large to fit through the normal entrance, so the crew removed several seats and expanded the cargo area. The dragons didn't like the enclosed space, but they trusted David. If he said it was safe, they believed him. As the dropship lifted off, David looked down at the canyon that had been his home for 6 months. He'd survived there. He'd built a family there. Now he was leaving it behind, heading back to human space. But he wasn't going back as the same person who'd been left behind on Ashfall Ridge. He was different now. He'd bonded with dragons. He'd learned to live in the wilderness. He'd raided a Krovan base and stolen their intelligence. William sat down next to David. "Your family thinks you're dead." "We sent notification months ago." David closed his eyes. His parents, his sister, they'd all mourned him. "Can we send a message?" "Already done. They'll know you're alive before we reach the fleet." The journey to the fleet took 2 days. During that time, David learned what had happened since the evacuation. The Krovan had taken 4 more colonies. Thousands of humans had died or been displaced. The war was getting worse, but his intelligence about Haven's Gate was changing things. The fleet had arrived ahead of the Krovan attack and was setting up defenses. When the enemy arrived, they'd find humans ready for them. David also learned that his story had spread through the military. The Marine who'd been declared dead but survived for 6 months on a hostile world. The soldier who'd tamed dragons and raided a Krovan base. People were calling him the Dragon Marine. He didn't feel like a legend. He just felt tired. When they finally reached the fleet, David stood at the dropship window and stared in awe. Dozens of warships hung in space, a massive show of human military power. The carrier Valor dominated the center, its lights blazing against the darkness. The dropship docked and David stepped out with his dragons. Hundreds of crew members had gathered in the hangar bay to see them. The crowd fell silent as David and his 4 dragons walked through. Admiral Foster was waiting. He saluted crisply. "Sergeant Cole, welcome back from the dead." David returned the salute. "Thank you, sir. Has the Krovan fleet arrived yet?" "Not yet. We're expecting them within 12 hours. Thanks to your intelligence, we'll be ready." Foster looked at the dragons with obvious fascination. "These are the creatures that saved you?" "These are my family, sir. Ash, Crimson, Sky, and Silver. They're as much a part of my squad as any Marine." Foster nodded slowly. "The brass wants to study them. Scientists are very interested. With respect, sir, they're not lab specimens. They're sentient beings. They've fought for humanity already. They deserve better, I agree. Which is why I'm giving you a choice, Sergeant. You can return to normal duty with your old unit, or you can serve as a liaison between humanity and the Dracari species. It seems we've made contact with an intelligent alien race through you." David thought about the ancient dragon that had spoken to him, the adults who'd saved them at the research outpost. There was something larger happening here, something beyond just him and his 4 dragons. "I'll be the liaison, sir, but I have conditions. My dragons are treated as soldiers, not animals. They have rights and protections." "Agreed. Now let's talk about Haven's Gate. The Krovan are coming, and I want you and your squad in the fight." The Krovan fleet emerged from hyperspace exactly when David's intelligence predicted. 40 warships bristling with weapons descended toward Haven's Gate. On the planet below, 2 million civilians waited in underground shelters, praying the defenses would hold. But the Krovan commander, General Vortok, quickly realized something was wrong. Human warships were already in position, their formations perfect for defensive engagement. His surprise attack had somehow become a prepared battle. "All ships attack formation," Vortok ordered. "Destroy their fleet." In the human command center on Haven's Gate, Admiral Foster watched the battle unfold on tactical displays. "Launch all fighters. Capital ships maintain defensive positions. Let them come to us." David stood in the operations room with his dragons, watching the space battle begin. Explosions blossomed in the void as ships exchanged fire. Human fighters swarmed Krovan cruisers like angry insects. The battle was massive, violent, and terrifying. "Sergeant Cole, we need you on the surface," a colonel said, approaching him. "Krovan drop pods are heading for the northern evacuation zones. Our ground forces are spread thin." David nodded. "Where do you need us?" "Sector 7. 3,000 civilians are still evacuating from that district. Hold the line until they're safe." David and his dragons boarded a military shuttle along with 2 platoons of Marines. The ride down through atmosphere was rough, the shuttle shaking from nearby explosions. Krovan fighters strafed human positions, their energy weapons leaving scorched earth. They landed hard in Sector 7. David could see the evacuation zones in the distance. Crowds of people rushing toward transport ships. Between them and safety stood Krovan ground forces. Armored soldiers, heavy walkers, and gun emplacements. "Listen up," David shouted to the Marines. "Those civilians need time. We give it to them. Hold every street, every building, every meter. Make the Krovan pay for every step." The Marines cheered. They'd all heard about the Dragon Marine. Fighting beside him felt like an honor. David looked at his dragons. They'd grown even larger, now the size of elephants. Their scales gleamed in the afternoon sun and their eyes burned with determination. They understood what was at stake. "You know the drill," David said to them. "We protect the innocent. That's what we do." The dragons roared in response, the sound echoing across the battlefield. Even some of the Marines looked intimidated. The Krovan forces advanced. David's unit took position behind makeshift barricades, using destroyed vehicles and rubble for cover. The enemy came in waves, dozens of soldiers supported by armored walkers. "Fire!" David ordered. The Marines opened up with everything they had. Rifle fire cut down the first rank of Krovan soldiers. Rocket launchers took out 2 walkers. But more kept coming. An endless tide of enemies. That's when David gave his dragons the attack signal. Crimson leaped over the barricades, landing among the Krovan with devastating impact. Its fire breath swept across enemy lines, turning soldiers to ash. Ash followed, its toxic smoke spreading through the battlefield and choking anyone who breathed it. Sky took to the air, lightning striking targets with precision. Silver's sonic blasts shattered enemy armor and threw soldiers like ragdolls. The Krovan had never fought dragons before. Their tactics assumed ground troops and vehicles. They had no protocols for dealing with massive, flying, elementally empowered creatures. Their formations broke as panic spread. David moved with his dragons, directing their attacks with hand signals. They functioned as a perfect unit, each dragon knowing its role. When Krovan reinforcements tried to flank them, Ash was already there to block the route. When heavy walkers targeted the evacuation zones, Crimson destroyed them with sustained fire breath. The battle raged for hours. David's Marines held their positions, inspired by the dragons fighting alongside them. Word spread through the human forces about the Dragon Marine and his squad. Other units fought harder, knowing they weren't alone. In space, the naval battle was turning in humanity's favor. The Krovan had expected an easy victory but found prepared defenders. Admiral Foster's fleet tore into the enemy ships, using David's intelligence about their attack patterns. One by one, Krovan warships exploded or retreated. On the ground, David's ammunition was running low. His dragons were tiring, their attacks less frequent. The Krovan kept coming, seemingly endless. David wondered how much longer they could hold. Then the sky darkened. David looked up and saw something impossible. Hundreds of dragons, all adult-sized, descended from the clouds. The ancient Drakari had arrived, just as they'd promised. The ancient one that had spoken to David before landed beside him. "You called for protection." "We answer." "I didn't call," David said, confused. "Your bonds with the young ones called. Their loyalty to you and yours to them speaks louder than words. We will not stand aside while humans fight for the innocent." The adult dragons swept across the battlefield like a storm. Their combined elemental attacks devastated the Krovan forces. Fire, lightning, toxic smoke, and sonic blasts turned the tide completely. Within minutes, the enemy ground forces were in full retreat. General Vortok, watching from his flagship, saw his invasion collapsing. Not only were the humans prepared, but they'd somehow allied with the Drakari, a species thought to be nothing but dangerous predators. His intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. "Retreat," Vortok ordered. "All forces fall back!" The Krovan fleet jumped to hyperspace, abandoning their ground troops. The soldiers left behind surrendered or were destroyed. The battle for Haven's Gate was over. David sat on the ground, exhausted. His dragons collapsed around him, breathing heavily but alive. They'd done it. They'd saved the civilians. Williams approached with medical teams. "You did good, Cole, real good." David looked at the evacuation zones. The last transport ships were lifting off, packed with civilians who would live because of what happened here today. 2 million people saved. The ancient dragon approached David one more time. "Human David Cole, you have shown our kind that the old bonds can still exist, that different species can stand together against darkness. We have been in hiding for too long, afraid to trust again. You and your 4 younglings have reminded us of what we once were." "What happens now?" David asked. "Now we emerge. We will speak with your leaders. We will forge an alliance between our peoples. And you, Dragon Marine, will be the bridge between our kinds." Over the following days, everything changed. The Drakari revealed themselves to human leadership. Ancient dragons met with admirals and politicians. Treaties were discussed. A new age of cooperation began. David was promoted and given command of a special unit, mixing human soldiers with dragons who chose to bond with them. His 4 dragons remained his primary squad, but others joined them. Young Drakari who wanted to follow the path Ash, Crimson, Sky, and Silver had started. The war with the Krovan continued, but now humanity wasn't alone. Dragon wings filled the skies alongside human fighters. The enemy found themselves facing an alliance they couldn't overcome. David finally got to make a call home. His parents wept when they saw his face on the screen. His sister couldn't stop asking questions about the dragons. They'd mourned him, buried an empty coffin, and now he was back. "I'm sorry I couldn't let you know sooner," David said. "Things were complicated." His father just smiled through his tears. "You're alive. That's all that matters. Come home when you can. I will. But I've got work to do first. People to protect, an alliance to help build." One evening, David stood on a cliff overlooking the colony he'd helped save. His 4 dragons rested nearby, their scales gleaming in the sunset. Ships moved overhead, human and Drakari vessels flying together. Crimson nudged David's shoulder gently. He scratched behind the dragon's jaw ridge, something he'd learned they enjoyed. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" David said. "From that collapsed bunker on Ashfall Ridge to this. I was declared dead, and maybe part of me did die there. But something new was born. Something better. Ash chirped softly in agreement. Sky and Silver moved closer, forming their familiar protective circle around David. I don't know what the future holds, David continued. More battles, probably. More challenges. But we'll face them together. That's what family does. He looked at the sunset, at the peaceful colony, at the ships in the sky representing an alliance that shouldn't have been possible. One Marine left behind and forgotten. 4 dragon hatchlings orphaned and alone. Together they'd survived. Together they'd changed the galaxy. The legend of the Dragon Marine spread across human space and beyond. Parents told their children the story of Sergeant David Cole and his 4 dragons, how they'd been found in the darkest moment and forged a bond that brought 2 species together. But to David, he was just a soldier doing his job, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, standing between the innocent and danger, and now he had the best squad in the entire galaxy to help him do it. As darkness fell, David and his dragons headed back to base. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were together, safe and at peace. For a Marine who'd been declared dead, that was more than enough. The Dragon Marine and his family had found their place in the universe, and neither the galaxy nor the Krovan would ever be the same. The end.